Hi, I'm Barbara Ryan, pharmaceutical analyst at Deutsche Bank, and welcome to Pharma Face Off. Joining me to discuss emerging disease therapies today is Lisa Henderson, Editor-in-Chief, Applied Clinical Trials, Kyle Bryan, VP Global Development, PPD, and Ben Weintraub, Director of Research, Wolters Kluwer. You know, as an analyst, people are always asking me, despite all the money that's been spent in pharma R&D, why are the results so poor?
When we talk about poor performance, I think we have to define what we mean by poor performance. But if you look at the number of dollars being spent versus the number of breakthrough successes or commercial successes that come out of that, I think anyone would say that that is a poor performance. The millions that it takes to develop a new drug and get it onto the market. But if you look at the effectively designed trials and some of the clinical results that are coming back, there are real successes and real segments and areas where I think we are seeing benefit. But overall, I think you're right. There's been a disappointment for what we've been putting in.
What does the industry need to do, to address, really, I think one of the issues that's been so difficult in drug discovery and commercial success has been the fact that the marketplace, the commercial market, has changed so much. Obviously, payers driving a lot of the decision. What does that mean about, how value is being defined in the marketplace?
We know that if a drug works and it's effective and it's safe, it'll get used. But drugs that are marginal improvements that offer the same mechanism of action over another one, there's an increasing pressure on a drug like that to show value as compared to other drugs as well as on its own. So the market does become more competitive. And like Kyle was saying, the costs of developing drugs and the risk of developing drugs hasn't improved.
I would agree. I think that the ability to market sort of mediocre benefits or minimal benefit simply because there wasn't a benefit previously, or, well, this is statistically better, doesn't necessarily lead to commercial improvement or something being truly clinically better sufficient for people to pay for it.
Just wondering about the new technologies. I think people viewed those as being a savior to this problem to some extent, making things either more simple or less costly.
It's one of those situations where the more you know and the more you learn, the more you realize you need to learn and that you don't know yet. And so while things like the Genome Project and some of the work that we've done in molecular profiling in tumors has been very important for us to really understand a disease, to wake up and realize that breast cancer is a dozen diseases, it's not one. These things have led us to see that the pathways are very complex and the trials will need to be necessarily complex. The time savings doesn't necessarily come from, crunching the timeline. It takes 6 months to do a phase 1 instead of a year. But at the end of phase 1, you come out with the right dose to go into phase 2, or you come out of phase 1B, 2A with the right combination to take on to phase 3.
That people thought that personalized medicine was going to make trials smaller, make trials quicker, isolate patients that are going to respond, and eliminate patients who are going to have adversities. And occasionally that happens, but very often it doesn't. I was going to bring up an example of bapineuzumab, which is an Alzheimer's drug in phase 3 now, where after phase 2 they had a good biomarker, which was whether the patient carried a particular genotype of ApoE4, and it would predict the response and predict the adversity. And instead of saving them money, they wound up deciding to do 2 phase 3 clinical trials, so it doubled the amount of money that they had to put into it. And each clinical trial design was separate and more complicated. And I think that's the rule we're finding from personalized medicine, that it's right now, with our current level of understanding, it's actually making it more difficult.
As the industry has responded to this much more complex and challenging environment, particularly on the payer side, we've seen an unsustainably high rate of failure in phase 3. I'm wondering, do you see any evidence that we are cutting products as an industry earlier?
We all want to find a way to fail fast in clinical trials so that you can decide after the end of phase 2 that that's it, we shouldn't go on. But I believe that as you're saying that the pipelines are more risky and less successful, there's an enormous pressure to take our compound forward just in case. And if you look at the products that do succeed, they really, a lot of them should have been cut in phase 2 because they had some very disappointing results before they wound up with good ones. Avastin failed in breast cancer, and everybody thought, not everybody, but a lot of people thought that there was no way that it was ever going to be a successful drug.
Sometimes coming from the outside, you're able to bring sort of the more critical review of what's going on in your development program and what the issues are with the drug, to be able to say, you know, this is not something that's going to be sustainable, or this is not something that people are necessarily going to want to use. We have a lot of our larger pharma that's cutting back on their R&D and are going into our going into the biotechs and forming alliances with biotechnology companies of various sizes to develop things to a certain point. I think they're a little better in that setting about saying, okay, this doesn't work. This is a no-go as opposed to a go. On the biotech side, some of the companies try to take things all the way, but they develop what I kind of think of as more of a paternal feeling toward their compound as opposed to a professional feeling, and this is their baby. And sometimes the role of the large pharma or the CRO is to explain to them that your baby is ugly. It should not go any further.
It's a difficult message to give to a small biotech because it's basically telling them that they should go out of business. A pharma company can cut a program and they can move on. A biotech company that cuts that program is basically shutting down its operations.
Right.
So you're saying there is synergy in large and small working together?
I think there can be. I think that there's always a lot of headbutting that when these come together. The small biotechs all view themselves as being fast and quick, and we can do anything, and we can do it quicker and better than large pharma can do. All large pharma has is money. They have multiple levels of bureaucracy. They move at a glacial pace. Sometimes, though, one of the problems in our market is that, you know, these small companies are rewarded by the market when they go from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. There's no encouragement to spend the time in phase 1 to really straighten things out. They get their reward by getting to phase 3, and then it may fail because they haven't done the homework. Scientifically, it always makes sense to spend your time at phase 1 and phase 2, or even at the preclinical level. But the stock market doesn't reward that.
You're making an interesting point. I mean, I think for that reason, large pharma got burnt by licensing in phase 3 products that were really phase 2B. I'm wondering to what extent, you know, are the relationships, which clearly are increasing and becoming much more strategic between pharma and CROs, to what extent, you know, are those relationships changing a lot, both financially and in terms of risk sharing? There seems to be a component where pharma is looking to offload some of the risk of their development program to the CROs in addition to more of the work.
I do agree with that. We are seeing more of that in the industry. The CROs are stepping in. They obviously can't take all of the risk because, as someone had pointed out at a conference, they're not in a position, if they were to get sued, if there were something wrong, you know, post-marketing, that to come back, that they can't handle that kind of risk. But the risk sharing is going on where the CROs are stepping in, they're taking on the employees, they're buying the physical spaces, and they are assuming that kind of risk. And the other thing I was thinking about was also the regulatory burden, you know, as you're talking about the smaller companies, the biotechs, and they really want to bring that drug through. Well, the drug ultimately has to get approved. So if you're not thinking through all the things you have to do for the regulatory, you know, you might not just get burned on the safety and the efficacy, but you might get burned just in something the FDA or EMA asks for. So
somebody once asked me, how can a company spend $700 million and 10 years and get to the FDA and something that they miss something? And my answer was, I don't know, that's a good question. I think people underestimate the complexity.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Lisa, Kyle, and Ben. And for the audience, I want to tell you that it's not over. So we hope that you can stay around and join us for overtime. And we want the conversation to include you. So please feel free to log on to pharmafaceoff.com. Give us your feedback on both this show and your thoughts on this subject or any other. Thank you.
Barbara, I wanted to go back, if I can, to the therapeutic areas that you mentioned, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, and cancer, because I think they represent a really different challenges in innovation and bringing value. Because in cardiovascular disease, we understand it pretty well, and we have a lot of medicines, and the question is, what do you add on to make it a little bit better? On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Alzheimer's disease, where we have nothing that works. And I think that everybody would agree that if we did have a drug there, it would be a blockbuster. But we just don't understand the brain well enough. And then cancer is very odd, and I know that Kyle works on this, but we had some success with targeted therapies, and we thought, well, we can extend that 2 months of survival advantage into 2 years if we use it more optimally. But cancer has been stubbornly difficult to address. And not only has it been difficult to figure out good combinations like we have in cardiovascular disease and earlier use, but a lot of the times, even when we have a VEGF inhibitor that works great, like Avastin, it hasn't really replicated that the next VEGF inhibitor also works.
I'd agree. You know, the idea of, or the kind of traditional thought in areas like cardiovascular, infectious disease, or a number of other areas is that, well, the first generation drug will do a certain amount, and then each drug that follows on it is going to be a little bit better and a little bit better and a little bit better. And we haven't really seen that in oncology and in the targeted therapies. In the early days of their development, I think that the concept of, well, you know, the not really understanding, understanding the target, what enzyme we're looking at or what pathway we're inhibiting, but not really understanding the target population. So there's this pathway, but it's more likely in a female non-smoker of Asian descent, and yet we identified it in a smoker. There's just a lot of slight confusion that has led to really colossal mistakes in the development area, the wrong trial design, the wrong population, and an attempt to sort of get that broad indication, which is where, you know, everyone sort of thinks, well, I want the broadest possible indication, but then you're spending a lot of money on a lot of people who aren't getting a lot of benefit.
Right, which kind of brings up, I guess, what you mentioned earlier in terms of the personalized medicine and targeted therapies, where obviously we've seen the most work done in oncology.
Right. There's a lot of use of the biomarkers, and in the trial design, trying to get the right endpoint in an oncology trial must be for these companies extremely difficult, because there are debates in the community about what do you measure as the endpoint for a true endpoint in an oncology trial. So, it gets down to you want to advance medicine, but you have to get it approved, so you have to go through the certain processes, and then you get down to problems with finding the right people, the inclusion-exclusion protocols, collecting the data, and it becomes just complex. So although we talked about efficiencies, having efficiencies in a therapeutic area, you think you can build on that, but it actually goes from being simple to more difficult, more complex. And
we see this real tension that you're talking about between, okay, I'm a pharmaceutical company, I want to design a trial for an oncology drug. And the academic community, my experts are telling me, be creative, be aggressive, use this endpoint. And yet I'm worried that the FDA is only going to look at this endpoint that they've accepted in the past. I have to show overall survival. I can't subset by all these different biomarkers and call that a primary endpoint. And so their solution, by and large, is to do both. And that gets very expensive. Mm-hmm. And you want to be creative and show that your drug really does have a place in the armamentarium. And you also don't want to get up to the FDA at the end of the day and have them say, well, you didn't do the gold standard test.
I guess, too, in hepatitis C, we're going to see, this in living color with the proteases, in that, it's very, very complex. And obviously, that both Vertex and Merck have done the trials looking at selective patient populations. And you can't really even compare one drug to another based on the trial results that are reported because of the vast difference in the underlying population. And then looking at, which patient populations may actually benefit from a shorter duration of therapy. So there's a big scientific advance, but at the same time, it's become increasingly complicated.
Right. It's not necessarily a commercial advance.
We're hoping that or some are hoping that it will be a
that
commercial
would be an exception
advance.
and be a real blockbuster.
Right. But you know, one of the things you'd mentioned as the trial starts to shift and we see, you know, the academic community and the clinical community accepting various surrogate endpoints, but the regulatory community lags way behind. You know, complete response rate in myeloma, and it took a decade after clinicians were accepting complete response as a surrogate for survival before regulatory would accept it. We're 20 years on from when we started showing real utility to PET scanning in assessing response and assessing burden of disease in various malignancies, particularly in the lymphomas. But it's really only now that the regulatory environment is catching up and, okay, yes, you can use that as an endpoint or a qualification criterion.
In the FDA's defense and the EMA, it's a tough job.
Oh, absolutely, and they get battered from every side, which is why I think they're like a pendulum. They rarely are exactly in the middle of what makes the most sense to the most people. They get pressured heavily from advocacy groups to move things forward quickly, and then they get heavily pressured when they've moved things forward quickly and the longer term data is showing, you know, complications either for safety or not as good a survival advantage, and then they have to swing back the other way. It's not a job I would want to have responsibility for.
And the end result plays into exactly what we've been talking about. It just makes things take longer. The FDA will wind up making the right decision, but may take an extra 3 years to do it. That's just increasing costs and increasing timelines for all these pharmaceutical companies as well.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting situation where, you know, we used to accept that if you lowered cholesterol, that was a good thing. And now, after Zetia and Vytorin, you know, you've actually got to show that more patients have fewer cardiovascular events to get a drug on the market to lower cholesterol. So we're back to the drawing board.
In a sense, that's a good thing. We're moving to we have good enough medicines now to do certain things, and we need to show that the patients are actually benefiting, living better quality lives and living longer. In diabetes, you need to show that you're not just improving glucose control, but you're improving cardiovascular outcomes. In obesity, we found out the last couple of weeks that the FDA cares that you're not just losing weight, but you're actually getting healthier.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, to a certain extent, I think this is a problem that the industry has created for ourselves. You know, almost every company in their mission statement that's about curing this and helping that and better lives for patients, and yet we really whine a lot when the bottom line isn't really coming up to play. But eventually all of these things are coming together to a better outcome for the patients.